So this is the Pantster or Plotter panel discussion. My name's Danny Crowe. I'm an author of a picture book called Waiting for Sogmok, and currently writing a novel, very tortuously, which is an adventure book starring a boy who's moved over from Hartlepool to Norway. So the title of this discussion is Pantster or Plotter, a chance for local writers to share strategies for outlining and plotting your novel. But let me just introduce, first of all, Maggie on my left. And so Maggie will always be a Leeds girl at heart, although she has lived in Ripon, North Yorkshire for the last 30 years. Her writing reflects her love of travel, modern languages, particularly French and German, fascination with family history, as well as many articles and short stories from magazines. Maggie has written several books, each completely different from the others. On my right is Samantha Priestley. And Samantha is an author from Sheffield. She writes novels, short fiction and plays. And she's the author of Bad Winter, which is her first ghost story. Brian Pentelow is next. And Brian has published the Sprocket Sagas for children of all ages, featuring a scrapped dragon, English bull terrier, a crow, the fearsome four, 3 girls and a boy. And Dragon World, with all kinds of villains and wrong-uns to fight. And he has a short sci-fi novel with a sequel that you're halfway through, because you have also told me that you're not a massive planner.
No.
Is John Jackson.
Certainly. My name is John Jackson, as you now know, and I used to be a ship's captain before I came ashore and then retired. And these days I write historical novels, mostly based around I've got an extremely colourful family tree. I had my first book, this one, published just a year ago, and I'm busy working my way through the next book, which is based on the next generation down in the family.
And what is a pantster? You might know what a plotter is a little bit better, but here are my definition on which we're basing our discussion. A pantster is a writer who writes by the seat of their pants. So you can make your own conclusion about what a plotter is. Someone who outlines significantly the events of the story before starting. So a show of hands for pantster. And a show of hands for plotter.
I'm a plotter.
And I'm in the middle because I'm 50-50, yeah. I think.
I spent 20 years going to see myself, and then spent another 20 years telling other people to go to see, while writing all their policies and procedures and all of this sort of rubbish, which meant you had to have a very logical way of thinking things right round the loop and back to where you started, which makes me think in a very procedural way. Now that is a plotter. But you can't do it all. You can't plot absolutely everything, because then you take the fun out of writing. Brian
is unabashed pantster.
My books are fantasy books. The beauty of fantasy books is that whatever I say goes. As nobody else inhabits these worlds other than me and my characters, I can do whatever I like. But, and there is a big but with being a pantster, it is quite easy to write yourself into a corner, and then it is necessary to go back and alter the whole thing so that you get yourself out of a corner. In this particular one, Sprocket and the Poison Portal, I had a basic idea. The basic idea came from Radio 4, the Today programme, which reported on a Welsh nuclear power station about to be decommissioned. And I thought, well, there's somewhere to start from. So I also had a bunch of fairly inept terrorists who were going to use this as a way of blackmailing the government out of a huge amount of money. And it was fairly easy to write what they were going to do, how they were going to achieve it, and what they would do within the power station to cause a huge environmental disaster unless their demands were met. Then I had to stop them. And what had to stop them was one small scrap dragon an English Bull Terrier, a crow and 4 children. But it is very easy in fantasy to write yourself into a corner. You're so bound up with the bad guys and what they're going to do and making that believable and making it a logical progression.
So on book 4, did you think, I'm going to hang up my Pantster hat and I'm moving to the dark side of the plotters because I can't handle any more of this work?
There are actually 2 factors. One, I'm bone idle, and the second thing is I have age-related tremors. Now, to be a plotter, you've got to write lots of notes. This is a completely pointless occupation for me because even if I write them, I can't read them when I've finished.
Well, neither can I.
So,
Maggie, you're a Pantster.
Well, yes and no. I think like most people, I'm a bit of a combination. It depends on the book.
Right.
I find that most of my work starts off as a core of something that's either happened to me or it's happened to a family member or somebody I know. As often as not, it starts from a true story and then it's embroidered. And it's the embroidery where the Pantster element comes in. Yes, this is my newest one. I won't go on at length about it, but it was inspired by somebody in my family who was a workhouse orphan, was moved up to Yorkshire at a very tender age to work down a pit, and married one of my great aunts. And his dilemma in the story was how he was going to get his brothers and sister out of the workhouse and reunite them all. So the beginning was his move to Yorkshire, the end was when he achieved his aim. The bit in the middle was where plotting came in, and also quite a lot of pantsing. So pretty much a combination.
You've been both at different times, so you started off as a Pantster, very much 100% Pantster, and do you say moving towards the other side?
Yeah,
you're not entirely there yet.
Well, I plotted this one mostly because it's based on a true story, a local legend I found from the Peak District. So I already had events. I fictionalised it, but because I already had these plot points that were going to happen, I knew exactly where it was going.
Right. You didn't have a choice then, did you?
Well, I could have changed it. I could have completely fictionalised it. Yeah. But it was such an interesting story that I wanted to keep those main plot points anyway. Yeah. I fictionalised quite a little bit of it because I only had brief information from this. It's from the 1750s.
If you can speak up a little, teeny.
Okay. It's from the 1750s, so I only had small bits of information, and a lot of it you can't be sure, how much of it is hearsay and how much of it's been changed and made up down the years. Yeah. So I did fictionalise quite a lot of it, but I did have main plot points throughout to go on. I wrote it a lot faster than any of the other ones.
Plotting made it faster?
Yeah, because I knew exactly where it was going.
Right.
Developing a character is probably as important or more important than actually trying to follow a given plot line. If you can develop your characters to the extent where you believe it, you have to believe in your character. If you have a plan, you can alter it. If you don't have a plan, you've got nothing. It's much easier to alter a plan than just to go absolutely, to fly by the seat of your pants.
For example, plotter assumes you know what a plot is, and actually if you research plot, you'll find 100 different definitions of plot. It's by Margaret Bechard, and she said, "Plot is merely the mechanism by which your character is forced up against her deepest fears and desires. And then perhaps it's those wants and fears and desires that tell you what the best plot is going to be for that character." My question was going to be, how much must you know your main character before you start writing?
I think you do need to know your main characters, whether they're good ones or bad ones, because their actions must be believable. If you've got a thorough bad hat, somebody who's capable of mayhem and murder, you've got a wide open scope. If on the other hand you've got somebody who has been forced into evil by circumstances and still has a certain moral code, then you must be governed by that moral code, Otherwise, the character becomes unbelievable.
Did anyone else on the panel start their book with a character without any events envisaged at all?
Well, yes, very much so, actually. In this particular book, The Wheels on Fire, I had a teenager in mind from the beginning. I taught teenagers for 30 years, and this is a girl who was stroppy to begin with and became even stroppier after the accident. But as I was writing the story, I could see her, I knew her.
I think some people start off with a location. I don't know if anyone started off with a location.
Yeah, my first one, I started with Kendal in the Lake District.
Right.
And I didn't know at that point what was going to happen or who the people were going to be. So I think it was the day when I went to Lake Buttermere, and when you actually get to the lake, it's quite cut off and enclosed, and it's quite moody and dark. And I thought, ooh, yeah, this would be a good place to kill somebody. So yeah, it kind of, the location did dictate what happened.
Yeah. And their main character absolutely takes a right when you meant to go straight on.
It's quite a common trope, particularly in some of the more old-fashioned romance novels, where there's the heroine who is really too stupid to live. When faced with she has to make a decision. She can go left to safety or right to death and certain doom in the most painful way. And of course she's going to go right, invariably. It's nonsensical, but it's how you bring tension into your story.
I think the most frightening thing is when a minor character takes over. He starts off with a very clear idea in mind of who your central character is, and all of a sudden somebody over there is doing things. You think, where on earth did that come from? I think that most writers are slightly mad.
Only slightly.
I went to see Con Iggulden last night as part of the Literature Festival, and he was talking about his writing, and he was actually experimenting with his wife to see if it was actually possible to smother somebody with a pillow, and his wife was trying to smother him, in fact, with different sorts of pillows and different materials, and apparently no, you can't smother someone with a pillow.
Well, I just wanted to have a word on subplots, and a little quote by John Truby about this, which says, "Plot is under the surface, the weaving of various lines of action or sets of events, so that the story builds steadily."
Well, very, very much so with this particular book. It's the longest one I've ever written. As I said, it started off as a novella. You might have noticed that the young couple I mentioned was standing in front of what looked like a railway tunnel. Well, that is because it came from the summer I spent in France, where I'd been enticed over there with a group of friends, was a super duper international work camp where we could all improve our French. And when we arrived, we found it was a complete shambles. It was actually run by a crook, and he was using it as a front for various other activities. It was such an intriguing time, all sorts of weird and wonderful people. So the core of it was pretty much from one viewpoint. But when I decided to expand it into a full novel, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger until I decided I had to call a halt, a lot of the minor characters from the first part suddenly assumed roles.
I've not had characters which have caused me problems, but I have had little side things. For example, in the second book, it's revealed that there is a difference in time flow between our world and Dragon World. So if you spend all day in Dragon World, you can actually do that between lunchtime and tea time and be back perfectly happy. But then, as it's become a series, and the fearsome four, my grandchildren as it happens, have grown up through these books, this time difference must have an effect on them, logically. What they get from trips to Dragon World is that they stretch these years, these weeks, these days by several hours in each case. So they grow more than their compatriots. This sort of thing had to be dealt with.
Because a lot of people talk about it flowing out of their fingers and they're almost capturing sentences. They're almost a conduit for something that's coming through.
Can the cameraman ask a question whilst you're on timelines? Because I've read Samantha's book.
The cameraman.
And you've got a timeline in there. You've got two distinct timelines, and it's interesting to know how you got, how you flip between those two, because they come together at the end.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could just say something about that.
The timeline from the 1750s is I had a small, true, well, supposedly true local story to go on, which got a bit weird, as you know. And then I had a modern day storyline running alongside it, and as you say, it comes together at the end and meets in a couple of places where the ghost of the original story comes into it, things like that. I had the old story plotted completely because I had the story there more or less. I changed some bits, but I more or less had a story there. The modern day storyline, I had most of it, but that side of it was a bit more free-flowing than the old one. So I still pantstered a little bit on the modern day storyline, more than I did on the old one, because I had the old one already.
And did you feel different in the two writings, if you like, when you were writing one and writing the other? Were you in a daze and flying?
No, wasn't. I'm never in a flying daze. No, that doesn't happen to me. Yeah, I suppose I did feel different. Yeah, I found the old story a lot easier to write. I had to check up on various things and the language and things like that. I had to make sure I got that right. But I think I found that one a lot quicker and easier. The modern day one, a little bit more difficult to put together. But I basically wrote them, I didn't write one and then the other. I wrote one chapter and then the next one immediately after. And I wrote it from start to finish without stopping and without going back at all. And I've never done that before.
At the back of all of my books, there's a list of characters that appear in that particular book. And they have been a godsend when writing the next one to be able to refer back to as to who did what and why.
Fairly recently I was invited to speak to a book group, and all the people there had read the book and made notes, and they started asking me questions about various characters, and I really had to rack my brains because it was quite a while since I'd actually read it.
I'm just going to give you another quote to see whether it sets your minds a-whirring, and this is sort of the end of the plotter, but a really good quote from Ian Forster is about the difference between story and plot. Story is the king died and then the queen died. Plot is the king died and then the queen died of grief. And it got me thinking that a plot is not just about events listed in order. You have to have a structure, a physical structure to your book as well. I thought structure is like a glass into which you pour your plot. It's like I could have a story bubbling around in my head and I wouldn't know how to physically present it.
Well, you can't have a plot without a story. You can have a story without a plot.
Oh yes.
Can you say a little bit more?
Well, if you take somebody like Virginia Woolf, there's no real plot to any of her stories.
I suppose there must be some people here. Did any of you people read A Year in Provence by Peter Mayle when it came out a few years ago? It was absolutely fabulous. There was absolutely zero plot in there. It was atmosphere from A to Z. And they tried to dramatise it with a really good cast, plenty of money spent on it, and it was lousy because it's not a story where anything happens.
But the book itself was successful.
It wasn't. Yes, but it wasn't sold on plot. What it was, like Virginia Woolf, exactly that. It was a great read, fabulous read. It really gave you a spirit of place, if you like. But nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened at all. Lark Rise to Candleford. It was postcard television. It was a lovely book. I'm sure we've all read it as well. It's been out for, it must be the best part of 100 years now. And they made a beautiful television series, but it was all atmosphere. And then they, basically just to keep it going, they essentially turned it into a soap. I mean, I write historical with a strong romantic thread, is how I describe it. So as soon as you bring the word romance into any type of genre, and God knows there are enough of them, you have to have a boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. That's your absolute basic structure. And of course, your book is the mechanics of that. And you can make that as grim and grisly, or as fun, or as light, as frothy as you like.
The initial part of your book must take the audience by the throat and keep them reading. The bit in the middle, it needs to develop, it needs to take the story along. What your audience will remember is about the last 3 sentences you say. Bang it to them in the first couple of pages, give them something interesting to read in the middle, and really smack them around the ear with it in the last couple of chapters.
I once heard another writer say, I can't remember who it was now, but I think he was a fantasy writer actually, and he said, as long as something happens in every chapter, you'll be fine.
There was a wonderful quote that I came across from one of my favourite writers, Terry Pratchett, who's a fantasy writer. And one of his characters says of a young woman who thinks she might like to become a writer. Well, he says, it's got to be the easiest job going. After all the words have been made. All you've got to do is shuffle them into an order.
Yeah.